Hi there. We're told that competition is the beating heart of capitalism, the sole cause of innovation, the rising tide that lifts all boats. Unsurprisingly, this is all nonsense. Since the dawn of capitalism, the system has consistently protected and favored monopolies, shielded corporate power, and reinforced the dominance of the wealthy, be they people or nations. From colonial monopolies of bygone eras to today's tech conglomerates, capitalism thrives on bribery, protectionism, and other policies that prevent and strangle real competition. It's a system that prioritizes luxury and leisure for the tiniest sliver of humanity over basic needs for all. Under capitalism, free markets are little more than a myth made to sustain inequality rather than destroying it. Capitalists endlessly talk about the supposedly central role of free competition, but history reveals a range of state-protected monopolies rather than adventurous entrepreneurs competing with each other, living self-sufficiently by successfully interpreting the mysterious musings of the free market. Early enterprises like the British and Dutch East India Companies enjoyed a level of protection they had from the state in the form of the state's military, or the state gave them permission to have their own military to hold and protect their so-called exclusive rights to trade, which created the first company and monopoly simultaneously. The East India Company introduced most of the essential elements of modern corporations: limited liability, permanent capital, and trade monopolies. But even these were based on strong government support, not market freedom, which goes a long way to explaining our world today. The Dutch East India Company was the monopolistic model, formed in 1602 by, merging rival companies under state sponsorship, which eliminated competition. How convenient. Its 21-year monopoly in Asia rested on a revolving fund, financing each expedition from the last, driven through business at cannon point. Military force and control over trade routes, backed by extra economic advantages rather than competitive production, allowed Dutch merchants to avoid direct competition and dominate global shipping, exploiting their far-flung network of trading posts and settlements in Asia. Domestically, the Dutch economy leveraged low-cost imports of grain from the Baltics, allowing local Dutch farmers to focus on luxury goods at the time, like dairy. Of course, it wouldn't be a modern corporation without insurance, in which the Dutch East India Company shareholders insured their own investments. Moving on to the British, their colonial capitalism had policies that the Dutch didn't, like the permanent settlement, which solidified a loyal stock of wealthy landowners that impoverished the peasantry, similar to how CEOs of companies do to their employees. So much has changed. The British turned India into a raw materials factory for British industry, fueling Britain's trade deficits while binding India's economy to British interests. In fact, India financed 40% of Britain's trade deficit. Anyways, 40 years later, a British commission reported that this policy had inflicted grievous oppression on the lower classes, reduced skilled labor to near extinction, which significantly contributed to the mass impoverishment of the native Indian population, now nearly fully dependent on the British. These colonial monopolies formed the basis of the economic system that persists today. The first capitalists relied on monopoly, privilege, and military force to get their will, shaping a legacy of violence, exploitation, and misery for most, and prosperity for the very, very few. Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Incogni. Information online can expose you to a wide range of dangers, from scams and identity theft to online harassment and stalking. Data breaches worldwide dump sensitive data online, and the number of victims of identity theft has gone up 42% since 2021. Data breaches like those just mentioned can leak plenty: your name, social security number, login credentials, home address, location history, and online activity into online databases. Anybody determined enough can access your personal details through people's search sites. Many data brokers sell this bulk data to companies, which may use it to target vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. Now that you're aware of the issue, let's talk about the solution, Incogni. Incogni contacts data brokers on your behalf, requests the removal of your personal data, and handles any objections they might have. Through an automated process, Incogni ensures your data stays off the market by making repeated removal requests. That's why Incogni's annual subscription is so valuable. It continuously protects your data privacy for as long as you're subscribed. For my viewers, you can get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan using the link below with my code HAKIM. How do you get started? First, create an account, grant Incogni the right to work for you by contacting data brokers on your behalf, and kick back as Incogni requests your personal data removal, handles any objections from data brokers, and keeps you updated on their progress every step of the way. So what are you waiting for? Click my link in the description, use the code HAKIM, and get your 60% off an annual Incogni plan and start protecting your data today. Thanks to Incogni for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video. What we just described has become what is known as the core periphery structure. In short, it's a rigged system where Western powers dominate economic structures through manipulation, pre-set up legal regulations that benefit them solely, and coercion. A vivid example of this is the Plaza Accords of 1985, where the United States and other Western nations, later becoming the G7, orchestrated a massive devaluation of the dollar against the yen to curb Japan's rising economic power. The real purpose behind these policies wasn't trade balance or whatever neoliberal nonsense, but simply protecting US industry from foreign competition, a tale as old as capitalism itself. In the 5 years before the Plaza Accords, the dollar had gained 44% against other currencies, resulting in record trade deficits and making American goods increasingly uncompetitive abroad. US economists, backed by institutions like the Institute for International Economics, lent support to pressuring Japan to engineer a re-evaluation of the yen to boost US trade. This manipulation led to massive asset bubbles within Japan's economy, and Japan's policymakers, desperate to mitigate the impact of the high yen, relaxed interest rates to stimulate growth. By the late 1980s, the resulting bubbles in real estate and equities grew out of control, hurling the economy into a high yen recession, due to a forced appreciation of the yen by roughly 73% between 1985 and 1988. The consequences for Japan were devastating. With exports now too costly to compete, Japan's profits plummeted, domestic spending dried up, and economic growth stalled, a trend that persisted throughout the 1990s and is arguably the reason for Japan's continued economic stagnation for 30 years since. Behind closed doors, the US Treasury worked with Japan's Ministry of Finance in secret meetings to ensure this outcome, demonstrating just how much control Washington held over Tokyo's economic policy. G7 deputies coordinated these details, culminating in the announcement made from the Plaza Hotel that they'd support orderly appreciation of non-dollar currencies, carefully avoiding the word intervention, even though that's exactly what it was. By 1995, American pressure had pushed the yen down to an artificial rate of 80 yen per dollar, dramatically different from the 360 yen per dollar it held in 1971. For people who don't like the economics of all this, basically what this means is that exports and production became way too expensive, which naturally destroys economic growth. No country would do this to their own economic structures unless they were told to do so at the point of a gun, or other metaphor for being forced. As usual, it wasn't just Japan. The capitalist core periphery structure inherently exploits developing nations. See my video on unequal exchange to learn more about that. These neoliberal policies forced on the periphery don't spur actual development. They impose a rigid framework, strangle national strategies, and weaken these countries' capacity to grow independently. This model, rooted in dependency theory, ensures that technology and economic progress stay concentrated in the industrialized core, while periphery nations are reduced to dependent suppliers of raw materials, lacking access to high-value goods and tech. Essentially, they're not allowed to industrialize. The little industrialization that is allowed is solely for producing and providing these raw materials to the imperial core. For these nations, the fallout includes worsening terms of trade, persistent inflation, and structural economic instability, all reinforcing their subordinate position in the global economy, by design. In recent decades, Western-led integration policies have only deepened the core-periphery divide. As global markets integrate, the rules of the game, written by the core for the core, restrict periphery countries from using traditional industrial policies, like tariffs and targeted subsidies, to build up their economies. Within the European Union, for instance, competition policies and free trade mandates prevent the use of industrial policy tools to benefit native economies, instead consolidating a central manufacturing core in northwestern Europe while sidelining other regions. The global capitalist system has failed miserably to encourage development across the board. The core nations accumulate industrial might, and the peripheral regions are stripped of it to directly support that end, amongst many other things. The system doesn't reward competition. It rewards those with the power and wealth to crush it. A glaring example of this lies in the way financial regulators are influenced, or captured, by the industries they are supposed to monitor. Regulatory capture means that banks often exert enough influence over legislators and regulatory agencies that the bills these banks write for their legislators actually become law. This capture allows banks to water down rules, enabling high-risk practices that ultimately lead to crises, like the 2008 financial crash. A parallel can be drawn to big tech, an industry that absolutely loves to obliterate their competition. Rather than facing the risks of an actually competitive market, companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon maintain their overwhelming dominance by aggressively acquiring emerging competitors. These firms don't really grow, they intentionally structure their platforms to lock users in, then raise the cost of switching, effectively shutting down competitors. In practice, this means that consumers and small companies are left in a market that's been tailor-made for the benefit of a few tech giants rather than encourage or even have genuine competition. These buyouts and mergers have led to extreme market concentration. With fewer firms in each sector, companies can coordinate to raise prices or build joint barriers to entry. The American airline industry, for example, has undergone substantial consolidation, with Delta merging with Northwest, United with Continental, and American with US Airways. As a result of these and other mergers, there are about 3 or 4 major airlines that now control the market, and consumers have been complaining about the result for decades. This is called decentralization of capital, something I've discussed in deeper detail before here. The pharmaceutical industry, once a fragmented market, also rapidly consolidated over the last 2 decades, reducing the number of major firms to just 10. This paved the way for extreme price hikes on vital medications. Some drug prices increased by up to 6,000%. Martin Shkreli's acquisition of Daraprim is perhaps the most infamous case. He raised his price from $13 to $750 per pill and gloated about doing so on Twitter. But Shkreli wasn't alone in this. He was merely the most visible player in the game the entire industry plays with little to no regulation. In the banking industry, the effects of regulatory capture and concentration are equally dramatic. During George Bush's regime, checks and regulations on mergers were all but dismantled, which led to a near unprecedented period of American history that saw levels of industry consolidation comparable to the original trust era that partly inspired the Sherman Antitrust Act. By 2012, over 75% of industries had witnessed increased concentration. However, the Sherman Antitrust Act wasn't always ignored, and there are a few examples of the US government breaking up major monopolies. The history of AT&T offers some insight into how monopolies are broken up and allowed to be somewhat reconstituted over time. After being broken up in the 1980s, AT&T reassembled much of its original structure through acquisitions, once again consolidating dominance by purchasing Time Warner and other companies. The cable, entertainment, and beer industries have experienced similar waves of mergers that raised prices and limited choices for consumers. Microsoft's practices in the 90s provided an example of how tech company monopolies would operate in the 20th and 21st centuries. They leveraged its Windows market dominance through licensing, which effectively forced them to promote Microsoft products instead of their own or a rival's. This basically set up a dangerous precedent. When dominant firms control the terms of engagement, smaller players and competitors are locked out. Eventually, after many years of complaints, the courts stepped in and decided a landmark antitrust case that forced Microsoft to allow, without any nonsense, third-party web browsers. Yes, there was a point when that wasn't allowed. But because it was allowed to go on for so long, there was considerable damage done to their competitors by the time the case was over. Which brings us to today, when Google faces similar antitrust scrutiny. The antitrust lawsuit against Google, which is ongoing at the time of recording, accuses the company of monopolistic practices in digital advertising and search markets, where its control is unprecedented. Even Standard Oil would blush. Their case highlights that Google's dominance isn't the result of offering better products at better prices or whatever capitalist bullshit, it's the result of a strategic effort to lock out competition and control vast amounts of personal data and other digital information. One of the primary issues here is the lack or complete absence of data portability, which would make it easier for consumers to migrate their data between platforms. Without it, users remain locked into Google's ecosystem, discouraging new entrants from competing. This isn't about data privacy, although that is an issue that my beloved JT covered very well in this video here. It's about restricting consumer choice and entrenching Google's dominance. One modern monopoly, PepsiCo, has been able to skirt regulatory scrutiny because of their methods which blur the line between monopoly and multi-product industries, and as of now remain legal. Instead of directly competing with Coca-Cola or trying in vain to buy them out, PepsiCo diversified by acquiring not competitors but fast food chains, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and KFC. These chains were then forced to stock Pepsi products exclusively that allowed it to embed itself in sectors beyond beverages, that still sold beverages so that they could sell their beverages. Lastly, vertical integration has enabled firms in multi-product industries to avoid competition by controlling the entire supply chain. Amazon is the, if you'll pardon the pun, prime example of that, but that pun is so bad that we'll stick with Pepsi and Coke. When Pepsi and Coca-Cola acquired major bottling operations, they eliminated double marginalization, which is supposed to reduce prices. But the opposite happened. It led to price increases for certain products because instead of passing the savings on to you, they could just charge you more because fuck you, that's why. The Federal Trade Commission raised concerns about reduced competition amongst Pepsi, Coca-Cola, and other beverage firms like Dr. Pepper, fearing that these integrated bottlers would engage in coordinated price setting. But this video is about monopolies, not duopolies, so we'll move on from now. On to economic imperialism and specifically structural adjustment programs. Developed and implemented by the US-controlled IMF and World Bank, are at the heart of a strategy to exploit emerging economies to cement Western, but mostly US, dominance. Emerging economies in Latin America, Africa, and Asia I prefer to say overexploited, which is more accurate, have faced loan conditions that demand severe cuts to public spending, reductions in labor rights, and the rollback of regulations on environmental and economic protections. These adjustments that are necessary, quote-unquote, for struggling economies are euphemisms to disguise this, quote-unquote, assistance, which actually serves to stabilize markets on terms favorable to the global north, maintaining a power imbalance that enables a continuous flow of capital and raw materials from the global south. I've discussed this phenomenon of unequal exchange in this video here, so you can check that out if you're interested in more detail. Instead, I'll give 3 key examples relevant to this video. The first is the classic example from Chile's experience under General Pinochet, who was all too happy to accept harsh structural adjustment programs following Pinochet's coup of the democratically elected Allende. IMF-backed reforms prompted massive deindustrialization, capital flight, and a near-total collapse in manufacturing jobs, which in sectors like textiles were remarkably extreme. Faced with soaring interest rates, local firms struggled to make debt repayments that eventually consumed nearly half of their revenues, which is, to put it lightly, not good for business. And while local capital fled, foreign capital poured in and non-traditional imports exploded, which further weakened Chile's manufacturing and deepened its dependency on external markets. This is not how you run an independent country. Next up is Mexico, which shifted from a domestic-friendly import substitution strategy, which is a fancy way of saying boosting domestic production to rely less on imports, to an import-dependent model, which obviously favors imperialist exporters. Just another one of the many perks that comes with these structural adjustment programs. In the 1980s, under IMF guidance, Mexico pegged the peso to the US dollar, which attracted foreign investment but ended up undermining Mexico's export competitiveness. Why? Well, as we saw with the yen in Japan, the peso was now greatly overvalued since the US dollar was worth far more than the peso, which pushed the trade deficit to record highs. By the late 1990s, the purchasing power of Mexico's working class had plummeted as currency devaluations and wage freezes took their inevitable, and arguably desired, toll. From 1982 to 1994, the number of billionaires skyrocketed while income inequality deepened, with the richest of them having more wealth than the poorest 17 million. Finally, in Peru, the Fuji shock reforms of 1990 provide a stark example of structural adjustment program-driven inflation. Overnight, the prices of essential goods skyrocketed. Gasoline rose 3,000% and bread by 4,000. This sent powerful shockwaves throughout all of Peru's economy, causing a death spiral. Real wages dropped by 50%, poverty surged to 59%, and urban slums doubled in size as people fled rural areas in search of work. This story is repeated across Latin America as structural adjustment programs prioritize the global North's interests over those in the global South. Hopefully this gives you a quick overview of the damage economic imperialism causes, what unequal exchange is, and broadly how it works. Again, for more details, check out my previous video. Now, in the United States, in 2018-2019, particularly under Trump, tariffs were imposed on approximately $450 billion in Chinese goods, which fucked up decades of carefully crafted liberal global trade agreements and reversed the then trend of reducing trade barriers. The stated objective was to curb China's economic ascent, despite its economy always supposedly being on the verge of collapse. Yet the impact was first felt by American consumers who faced higher costs since the tariff costs were simply passed down to them. Specifically, the US raised tariffs on Chinese goods, such as metals and machinery, while leaving tariffs on goods from other partners relatively unchanged. However, China took this realignment in its trade relationships to reduce dependency on American imports, undermining global US influence and increasing BRICS' economic power. In New York, in response, China did the same thing to the US, and the result was pretty bad, actually. For example, the agricultural industry in the United States, particularly in Midwestern states, suffered as a result of raising tariffs from 8.3% to 28.6% on the range of 908 products. This affected $32 billion worth of US exports, with soybeans being particularly impacted since China previously bought about 50% of all US soybean production. Remember BRICS? Well, the B stands for Brazil, and that is who stepped in to provide China with their soybeans instead. Let's see some more American policy silliness. China is better than basically the rest of the world at making electric cars, solar panels, batteries, etc. As a result, Chinese electric cars are sweeping the world as the best and cheapest on the world market. America decided to apply tariffs to Chinese electric cars because the American car industry simply can't compete. Many other countries, however, have not done this, which long term gives industries in those other countries a competitive edge over the US, as they can get cheaper and better quality vehicles, improve their own output at lower prices, and outcompete the US in whatever relevant field they inhabit. Repeat this over all the Chinese commodities getting tariffs slapped on them, and this is reproduced 1000-fold, with all extra costs instead passed on to the American consumer and further driving inflation up. The US approach of using the economic equivalent of blunt force and assumed the heavy tariffs would bring China to its knees. However, data shows that the US incurred a deadweight loss of $7.3 billion, which added to the losses in exports amounts to nearly $40 billion in losses. By the end of 2019, both countries reached a high-tariff, non-cooperative equilibrium, essentially meaning that the effect the US administration was hoping to get, impeding Chinese growth to the benefit of American industry, simply never materialized. By now it should be abundantly clear that the nonsense idea of the free market is a facade. The history of the system reveals centuries of monopolistic manipulation and exploitation because it served the imperial core. I barely scratched the surface. I've given you basically no examples, but even the few that I did give you are enough to illustrate the point. Capitalists have always relied on state-backed control, not fair and open competition, to maintain a stronghold on power. Only when they begin to lose said competition do they drop the mask, accuse the other side of cheating, and start implementing impotent tariffs or other protectionist measures. Today, tech giants like Google and Amazon don't innovate to compete, they buy out rivals and stifle choice. The free market isn't free for the global south, which is forced into debt traps and economic submission through structural adjustment programs that enrich the global north at the expense of the global south. This isn't a system built to uplift the mass of people, this is a system that exists to consolidate power and wealth for the few while systematically sacrificing the many. One good book recommendation to get you started, and is very readable, is Kicking Away the Ladder: Developmental Strategy in Historical Perspective by Ha-Jun Chang. Another, by the same author, is Bad Samaritans: The Myth of Free Trade and the Secret History of Capitalism. Both of these are must-reads to get even a simple understanding of how all of this came about and the mythology around it all. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kudrow. Thanks for watching.